After the fall of the home computer industries that were born in the 80s and 90s, the standardization of the PC, the DOS-based machine, began to take rise for home computing and home gaming. And unfortunately, that still brought with it all those wonderful hassles with IRQ conflicts and memory management and the fun things many of us remember. It was the standardization of APIs in Windows that finally brought a unity and a true semblance of plug and play to PC gaming. Our guest today is one of the architects of the modern world we live in as gamers today. Welcome to the show, and I really probably should have asked about this before I started. The proper pronunciation of Servan Keondjian?
Keondjian, yeah, that's pretty good. Servan Keondjian.
Okay. I got much closer than I ever thought I would. Welcome to the show. So before we get started with the really the germane part for probably most of our listeners, Direct3D, but probably not what we'll spend most of our time on. Let's start with your educational background, because you are not originally a computer scientist, correct?
No, I mean, in the early days when I started, there weren't so many computer science courses. And I grew up in the UK, and I was started originally on the ZX81.
Oh, okay, we're going.
Yeah. There was a kit. You could make one of them yourself. I made one. I think it was for £20. I managed to buy the kit, which was a big deal. I was a kid. I upgraded to a BBC Micro. I was very excited to go from 1K to 32K, which seemed like a load of memory until I filled it up.
Now, quick question about the ZX81.
Yeah.
Because I've talked to many people who did use them, but I have never talked to anybody who actually put the kit together. Now, I've always heard the rumors about the unreliability of Sinclair-made kits. Did it work for you the first time you put it together?
It worked. It worked.
Oh.
I was pretty amazed. Even like the keyboard was a sticker. You know, you had to peel the back off the keyboard and stick it onto this plastic case. It was great.
Oh, awesome. Okay. Now, how old were you when you got the 81?
I was 11.
11. Okay. Oh, wow. So you're putting this together when you're 11. That's impressive right there.
Yeah. My holiday job around that time was I used to do circuit boards. I used to solder components onto circuit boards for a holiday job. So
wow. Was it just a local company or?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Interesting. Okay. So you move up to the BBC Micro. And you fill up the 32K. And now, what kind of programs are you building at that point?
I was just into games. I mean, I was like games. I was nuts about it. I just wanted to make. I was like, I didn't really believe I could make my own games at first, and then I just kept hammering at it, and I started realizing, hey, maybe I can do this. It's about getting it fast enough, because I started programming in BASIC. Everything went really slow, and then I learned what assembly language was. I started getting into that.
Okay. And okay, so you're learning the 6502 at this point.
Yeah.
And you're filling up 32K with your games. Where does that take you? Do you start seeing this as you're getting older as a career, or?
I was a kid. I was not thinking about careers. I was just doing what I was excited to do. I just wanted to make a game. I wanted to make graphics. I was working on the BBC. It was sprite routines. And then with a friend, I put together a bunch of utilities for the BBC Micro. We got it out on a floppy disk, and we were sending it to local shops. We sold out, and we started providing new stock. It was called the Expert Utility suite of software. On there, I wrote a really nice sprite editor engine. Would let you edit your sprites. He did some disk formatting utilities, because in those days there weren't good disk formatters built into the OS. It was crazy days. We made some money, and off the back of that, I managed to buy what was then just coming out, the Acorn Archimedes.
Oh, okay.
Which had 32-bit operating system, 32-bit architecture. And it had a megabyte of memory, the one I got. or maybe it was 4. There was one with 1 and one with 4. So then I really jumped to 32-bit assembly code, which was really nice. And it was on that I started doing 3D work.
Okay, so yeah, and for our American listeners, especially, the Archimedes was, am I underselling it by saying it was essentially the follow-up to the BBC Micro and sort of on level with things like the Amiga?
Yes and no. I mean, the main thing about it, it was maybe a little bit more advanced technically than the Amiga, but the main thing about it was just the introduction of the ARM processor.
Yeah.
So the BBC Micro guys went on to develop the Archimedes. It wasn't marketed by the BBC anymore, so it didn't have quite the same reach, but it had a great CPU. And that's what, that was like, oh, I want this, that's what got me excited, because I was all about what was possible with the power of that.
Gotcha. So what kind of 3D routines are you doing on this? Or what kind of 3D games are you building at this point?
Well, I got my first, when I was 15 by this point. I got my first rotating 3D cube on the screen, which was huge because I had a triangle fill routine running real time. I had the lighting going. I had the transform going. Those are the main, in those days, you just had to fill a triangle fast, which was the main thing. Then you had to transform the points fast and get the lighting going.
Gotcha. Okay, and what, so you've got all of this, you're basically building it from scratch. I'm guessing there's no instructions for this in the basic or any.
It was all assembler.
All assembler.
I mean, I had you would write some basic boilerplate stuff to allocate the memory and to set things up, do that in basic, and then all the routines are in assembler.
Okay, and this is, my knowledge of programming is extremely rudimentary, so please excuse me if this is a dumb question, but does the machine have enough cache to be able to process that, throw it into cache, and then throw it to the screen? Or are you having to process this basically on a line-by-line basis as the processor is filling in the triangles? You're just prioritizing.
Well, you always do things line by line anyway. A cache is invisible on some level to a programmer. Now, the first ARM CPU had no cache. And in those days, CPUs didn't have a cache. So you could do things like unroll a loop for a whole line of the screen, which is one of the things you would do. You would, instead of having a loop that fills pixels, you'd have repeat the code for the whole line. And you would just jump to the right part to draw enough going to the end. So you didn't even need a condition to check to loop back. You would just run through the code. So you'd have a scan line of drawing.
Interesting. Okay.
Then when the ARM2 came out, it was the first time they put a cache on a CPU that I'd seen. It was like this, it was this new thing. There's like this thing called a cache on a CPU. And that means there's a limited memory that runs fast. So you couldn't just have a big sprawling piece of code that you jumped into. And then there was this toss-up of how long a loop could you run that stayed in the cache. And that's when cache-sensitive programming became relevant for the first time in my life.
Okay. And what machine did the ARM2 launch on?
I can't remember.
It's something I could look up. But yeah.
No, maybe it was a second processor, or I just remember there was a cache appeared and I had to deal with it. I mean, we're going really pretty way back for my brain right now. But that was when I first came across it.
Gotcha. So you're doing all this while you're still in school and doing your A-levels, I'm guessing. And yeah. So when it comes time to finally go to university, what direction are you going?
I went for a physics degree.
Okay.
But during my degree, I was spending more and more time coding. And I also started playing as a musician in a band, so I was pretty busy with extra school, extra uni activities. The code went really well. I was able to put that in as my final year physics project to do the lighting, and I wrote up a good report on that. I did just scrape my degree, but I wasn't really visiting university that much. I was pretty busy on the other stuff. And after that, I went to work in a company called Magnetic Scrolls, which might be relevant. Don't know.
Yeah, they were well known for their text adventures with graphics.
Exactly. We used to
Yeah,
compete with Infocom.
yeah.
They hired me because they saw what I'd written in the engine, and they wanted to get into more fast action shooter games. Um, and the stuff I'd written, my engine was coming along really nicely. I had an editor by now, and it was all running on the Archimedes. Um, but they wanted me to start bringing the Magnetic Scrolls into shooter type games. But I got pulled into helping out with the sprite routines and the Archimedes version of their last game, Wonderland, at the time.
Yeah, that was the one that was originally on the Mac, wasn't it? And then
Yes.
it's on the Mac.
Yeah, they had what I learned at Magnetic Scrolls was how to do cross-platform code. They had some incredible systems for going cross-platform. They had their own version of GCC, and all the code for the game was written in their own assembly language that would run on their own emulators for all the other platforms. So all they had to do was port the emulator for their game.
Okay, and so you're porting this over to the Archimedes, and are you? I guess you're building the emulator from scratch, so it'll run on the Archimedes at this point.
Some of it was done. I did the Archimedes port, and then I did the Archimedes version of Wonderland for Magnetic Scrolls, put in the framework so all their games could run on it. And then the company was heading towards closing down. So it was not a good time. They'd invested a lot of their time in making a windowing system, just as Microsoft was bringing out their windowing system, and that's difficult to compete.
Yeah, just a little bit. I remember when that game came out and how hyped everybody was about the windowing system, and then it was like, okay, I just played for a very short while. I tried it out, and it felt a little clunky, if memory serves me.
Yeah, I mean, it was a hard job to get it to work on all those platforms, but technologically, I think it was well ahead of everything. But
yeah. Well, and so I guess you're there at the time. Obviously, Windows has existed in some form or another before this game comes out, but what was the mood inside the company like as they're seeing this evolution?
We were still excited about getting our stuff out, but we could see the end. It wasn't a good time.
Gotcha.
But we were still young coders. We just were excited about the technology of what we were doing. Getting things to work, getting things to ship was just what we wanted to do. But remembering now, the important point for me was the other coders there were teasing me about the Archimedes and saying I had to get onto DOS. And I was like, no, I don't want to do that. I don't want to write 16-bit code. I like 32-bit code. And just then, there was these other things coming out called DOS extenders that allowed you to get to the 32-bit versions of the new CPUs, which was, the i386 was just coming out.
Gotcha.
So that seemed like bearable to me. I thought, great, I'll move my 3D stuff over. And it was also then, it was Doug at the time, Doug Rabson, who had written a lot of the emulator stuff and maintained all the infrastructure there at Magnetic Scrolls. Said, oh, and you should do it in C. I said, oh, really? Will it go fast enough? And he kept persuading me to do it in C, and I did. So that was when I switched from assembly language to C, and I brought up a C version of my engine on the PC.
Gotcha. Okay, so you're now moving away from system specific because C is much more portable.
Yeah.
So there's and you're using DOS extenders, which now, again, not a programmer. So did you have to build those into your code, or Could
No,
you rely on?
there was a new compiler out. I think it was called the Wacom compiler that had
Okay.
a DOS extender. You just linked it in and it did it.
Okay. So now you are porting everything to DOS. Where do you go after the company goes belly up?
I decided I wanted to, at this point, try and make my own company out of the engine. I was also still quite a lot of time playing music. I gave that a go, but I was continued developing the engine. I wasn't sure if it was going to be a game. I was more going towards a game at that time because I didn't know you could really make it with engines.
Yeah,
That was, you didn't, there wasn't such thing as engines really, but you built one to make a game.
gotcha. Yeah, and it wasn't really a business model yet at this
Yeah,
point.
yeah.
So that company is RenderMorphics?
I started RenderMorphics. It was, yeah, it came out of a program. Yeah, I started it. I came up with the name RenderMorphics. I joined up with Hugh, who was another guy working at Magnetic Scrolls. Um, he's still in touch with all these guys. He's still bringing back some of the Magnetic Scrolls games with a new project he's doing. But he started helping me, and we were working on different aspects of making the 3D go fast, building a game, doing the AIs. It was a space game. It was a sort of elite type clone, space
Okay.
trading, and we were he was working on developing the AIs for the enemy ships so that you could have nice space battles.
Okay. So this would have been around the same time as Wing Commander is coming out and X-Wing is on the
A
horizon.
little bit before that, but
A
yeah,
little
so
bit before.
we were probably the same time as they were being developed.
Okay, gotcha. And your target platform was DOS. You weren't trying to go cross-platform to anything else at that point?
Uh, we weren't cross-platform, but what happened was one of the stages to crystallizing as a company. Somehow we got a link to another company in England. I'm trying to remember what they were called. They were called DuPont Pixel. That was it. And they were doing high-end OpenGL 3D. And somehow Kate Seekings, who I would set the company up with, got us in touch with these guys. And we went over and showed them our stuff on PCs. And they were, well, that's on PCs, that's no good. We need it on Spark stations and Unix boxes. And we said, no problem, just give us one and we'll do a port for you. So they gave us, we actually literally, after showing them the demo, we put a Spark station in the car they lent us. We took it home, and I think in a week we had a Spark station port. And we brought it back and then showed them, because they were making hardware 3D graphics. That's what this, or they were doing an OpenGL version that ran on their hardware.
Okay.
And we could beat their hardware performance with the software renderers that I'd written. Even in C, we hadn't even done an assembly language version. So that's the essential part of that, was that this was a company that was making OpenGL as a business. They were providing OpenGL with their Spark Station hardware, and they were selling the API, and they convinced us to build an API at that point. And so that's when the idea of turning into an engine company emerged.
Okay, so you guys, now why did they want it on Spark stations and Unix and Unix?
Well, PCs were still, most people weren't using DOS extenders. They were locked into the very small memory. And so Unix was a more professional platform in those days. And for doing 3D graphics and high-end hardware acceleration, you needed a Unix box or a Silicon Graphics. And this company was, in a way, providing a competitor to Silicon Graphics by making Spark stations with their own custom hardware.
Okay, so they weren't going for gaming; they were going for 3D rendering and all
CAD,
those type of
high-end
use.
CAD, yeah.
Okay, okay. So, and had you had any experience with that application of 3D at that point?
No.
No. Okay.
All new. We were just like, we wanted to make games, but they said, look, they said you couldn't make it run on a Spark station, and we said, yeah, we can. And they wanted to see how fast it went, and on a very high res, the hardware would always win, but on lower res for small triangles, we would win hands down. So for very dense meshes, software rendering is always faster.
Okay. And so you did you start working for them or on a contract basis? What was the relationship?
We made them an API, and we started talking more to bigger companies that weren't just game studios. That was the shift. It got us thinking about that. Oh, and they did at some point take us towards a deal. I can't remember the timing of this, but they got partially bought out by Creative Labs.
Oh, okay.
Because Creative Labs wanted to get into 3D hardware. But this is slightly later now. We maintained a relationship with those guys. We had a good relationship. But later on, they got bought out by Creative Labs, and they did a deal with us to get our API working with the creative hardware. I think they're making a 3D blaster, like the Sound Blaster.
Yeah.
And so they helped us negotiate that deal. And it's one of the things that launched Rendermorphic's really bigger, the partnership with Creative Labs.
Yeah, I remember the 3D blaster coming out. That must have been what, the late 90s, 98, 99, or was that?
I'm not going to be very good with dates.
Oh, okay.
Probably better than me. But yes, something like that.
Okay.
Well, maybe a little earlier, because we got bought by Microsoft in 95.
Yeah. Yeah, so it must have been.
That upset a lot of people because we were partnered with a bunch of other companies that didn't like Microsoft.
Well, and that's an interesting relationship, because you're working with creative, you've got the OpenGL movement is happening. You're
Collider Labs as well. We did a big deal with. That was a consortium between Apple and Microsoft. No, not Apple and IBM, sorry.
Yeah.
Called Collider Labs. They were making a new set-top box with their own 3D hardware. We did a port for them as well of our API, and we did a deal with them.
Okay. And so all of this is going on. And I got to ask now, from a technical standpoint, from a legal technical standpoint, when you're doing these kind of deals for the API and for the ports of the API, who owns that intellectual property? I mean,
we do.
You do.
We do. We're licensing the technology. We're doing technology licenses. So you don't sell it to someone, you license it. So you license it for a particular platform, particular use case. So we licensed it to the 3D Blaster platform and for all the developers on it. So that was the deal we did with them. We licensed it to Collider Labs. So for their set-top box, they could use it for all of their developers. So that's how we would do the deals.
Okay. Now, were there any restrictions on backwards compatibility with future versions of the API, or access by the licensees to future versions of the APIs?
I think we kept supplying it. I think there were long-term deals.
Okay.
We kept upgrading, and it was our responsibility to keep things compatible. It was the Rendermorphic's API was at that time very simple and very clean. That was one of the great things about it. It was a really nice API, really very simple to use, and it meant that things could port and move very quickly and very easily.
Gotcha. Now, as you are partnering with different companies, and they're no doubt introducing new hardware capabilities into their designs, or at least I'm guessing they are. How does the cooperation work to make sure that the API can take advantage of those new functions without losing compatibility with other systems?
Well, we had to do a lot of learning. This is what was exciting for us. We were learning about the 3D hardware as 3D hardware was basically being invented all around us. And we had an incredible insight into the whole industry from what we were doing. From the high-end guys with these DuPont Pixel working with Spark stations. So we also did an SGI port, and then all these new PC hardware, 3D Blaster. There was all sorts of stuff coming out. So we had to design a driver level for our API, and we didn't get it quite right the first time, but we had a few iterations of that. So that's when we started re-engineering our API to have an underlying driver model, so we could keep the API pure and clean and have our driver model and just port the driver to the 3D hardware. And that driver was evolving as we were learning what hardware was coming out. We knew what people were developing down the line, where to draw the line, whether it just does rasterization, whether it does transform, or what we have now with the shader models. All of that stuff was our consideration, and we were crystal ball gazing the hardware timeline at this point, and it was really exciting.
Okay. So, and again, for the technologically impaired, the driver would basically then be the medium that would say, okay, we're going to use X, Y, and Z parts of the API, but maybe A, B, and C doesn't get used on this hardware, but does get used on different hardware. So does the API have all the functions in it? The driver is sort of a limiter?
The driver runs on the hardware. It does all the stuff that the hardware needs to boot up the hardware, initialize it, and then actually make it function. But the driver has a standard interface that works with our API, so the two link.
Okay.
So as long as we have our driver, the API can do its thing. The API never needs to change. And the driver has an API that also never needs to change. It's just lower level.
Okay. And so you're getting all these new innovations are coming. What were some of the bigger challenges as the new chipsets or the new hardware was coming in? Was it just figuring out what it was going to do, or whether or not, or what were the big challenges in understanding the new technology?
Yeah, it's to get a big picture understanding of what's coming down the line, design something that's not going to slam you into a brick wall, so it's future-proof enough that can keep making the innovations without having to change the interface back to the applications that are running on our stuff. So the challenge is, let people write games now that can run on the 3D hardware that's there now, but that those games don't need to keep changing with the next piece of hardware. And what's the right hardware model design? What's the thing that gets enough performance and doesn't limit the performance on those bottlenecks? So that was what was fascinating me. How can we get the best architectures for that? And that was what was exciting.
Cool. And as you're creating the API and the drivers, and there's companies applying them to making games, what is your role in communicating the functionality and the use of the API to those software developers, to those game makers?
I was trying to educate as best as possible, because we're in such a period of flux now, that 3D hardware was coming along, but the 3D hardware that was out right now wasn't that good. Software rendering still goes faster, but software rendering, you have to make all sorts of different compromises. For instance, with software rendering to go fast in those days, you didn't really do full RGB rendering. You did palletized rendering. We had some very fast palletized renderers in the engine, but the 3D hardware would work in an RGB mode where you could have much richer lighting. It worked, but it had 3 channels instead of 1, basically. But that would slow down the software stuff. So to help the developers understand how to build a game that could run with the palletized stuff fast for when people didn't have hardware, but run with the RGB stuff, that was tricky. It wasn't so clean, and that was the messiest part of the whole gig. And educating people how to make a game really worked well with that, so they could switch between the hardware and software. That was the hardest thing to do in those days, and how to make it clean.
Now, that was basically something that the developers had to implement, or was that something that you could implement on the API side?
We helped them as much as possible, but they had to make choices for their game and how their game was working. like going back in the old days, you always had to pick when you made a game how many colors, what resolution you're going to use on your PC, or because it would be a huge trade-off between how much memory, how much performance, and depending on the type of game you're doing and the look and feel of the game, you want to make those choices. So you could still write a full RGB game with the rendomorphic stuff. It would go slower, but maybe you can take that performance trade-off because you've got some great visuals.
Gotcha. Now, were you actually being brought in to consult with the programmers on any of these projects, or was it just
yeah? I mean, the reality was to make these decisions. I mean, we had to work closely with the developers, and it was only the ones that got close to us that could make those decisions well. I mean, the smart developers would either make their own engine, or they could really understand our stuff well enough. So it was tricky to make something work really well off the shelf until the hardware started getting faster.
Gotcha. And you don't have to name any names, any particular horror stories you remember from back then, or particular examples of code that did not work?
Well, things went really fast with Microsoft showing up because we were being used by quite a lot of studios. And then Microsoft started chasing us and aggressively trying to buy us, and we really didn't want to be bought. But in the end, they just kept saying that if we don't buy you, we'll buy your competitors. They said, we prefer you. We think your code is nicer, API is nicer, people like you and can work with you, and we think we can work with you. But they said, we're Microsoft. If we don't buy you, we'll just buy the other one. And so we just agreed to do the deal. We were pushed into that corner. And so the horror story for me was what then happened with, we were supporting all these studios that then Microsoft said, well, those guys are running on the Sony PlayStation, and you can't, we're Microsoft, you can't support those guys. And we'd got really close with all of these other developers. We were partway through the projects. It was really not, it was not a position I wanted to be in. And we had originally said with Microsoft that we wanted to keep supporting all of these studios. And I don't quite understand how it happened, but we thought we were legally okay to support those studios. But once we were within Microsoft, they were just telling us we can't do it. And
oh man.
So that was really rough.
So you guys were actually, the API was being used basically on every hardware, or so you were on PlayStation. Were you on Saturn as well?
We weren't on Saturn. I remember, I think it was the guys at NVIDIA had built that. It was Jensen, because I remember a meeting I had once I'd come into Microsoft with the guys from Sega came, and it was Jensen who was he's the head of NVIDIA now. And I remember him because they were doing forward texture mapping. There was this big thing where the Saturn would take quads and map them onto quads. But we'd moved on from that. We had what's called reverse texture mapping, where you could map textures generally onto triangles. And I didn't want to put not their type of texture mapping into Direct3D as an API, because it had to be a completely Saturn specific thing. And I was getting a lot of grief from Microsoft management that I was upsetting the guys at Sega, that we couldn't support the Sega Saturn. And then I had to have a meeting with Jensen, who I think was making the 3D chip for Sega. And this is what NVIDIA came out of. But the whole point of making Direct3D and a nice API is that you make one API. You can't make a different API for each piece of hardware.
Gotcha.
So I got into trouble because I said no to Jensen, but it wasn't going to work otherwise.
Yeah, I remember they released an add-on card for PCs that was essentially using that quad technology. Yeah, and a handful of games supported it, but it was essentially, if it wasn't a Saturn game, it wasn't going to be supported because it was doing things so much differently.
Yeah, and that was like, it would have made Direct3D really ugly to put that in. I mean, there was enough hoops we were jumping through to make all the different cards work.
Gotcha.
Because at that time, each hardware was trying to go off in their own direction to make it different so they could innovate. Whereas what we're doing with an API is trying to bring everything into the same. So,
well, so we've jumped forward a little bit. So you guys get bought out by Microsoft. I'm guessing with the specific purpose of integrating this into the existing DirectX architecture, correct?
it was a little different when we first got bought. DirectX didn't exist. They were doing Windows 95. They knew, Microsoft knew it had problems with Windows Media. They needed to get games off DOS, and so they bought us essentially for two things: for credibility in games, because they didn't have it, and for the experience with 3D hardware, and bringing that in. So they bought the team, in effect, for the experience, and they wanted to bring that into Microsoft to bring in the credibility. Then the first version of Direct3D was a Reality Lab bolted into Windows. It wasn't called Direct3D. It was still called Reality Lab, and it was running our older way. It was supporting our older studios. So we still were wanting to work with all the companies and give them a way into Windows. Then there was a lot of politics going on about where we should go. We were in the media team, and then I met the guys who were doing Direct Draw, which was 2D at that time. And they were saying, hey, you should come with us. And I was having different teams pulling me in different directions, and I was new to politics in a big company. This was all like, I just want to write code. I just want to make it work. But I realized, I started learning this is how it works. In the end, the Direct Draw guys, to me, seemed to know what they were talking about. They were going 32-bit, or they wanted to go in that direction. I said, look, if we're going to do this, we got to jump to 32-bit, because the Windows GDI, the graphics interface for Windows, even in Windows 95, was still written in 16-bit code. And I was saying, I don't want to put all the 3D stuff down to the 3D hardware in 16-bit. We don't want to do that. I said, I'll come with you, Direct Draw, if we can do one thing. I said, we're going to have to move Direct Draw into the Direct3D days, because I said Direct Draw surfaces, which they were doing all this sprite stuff. I said, those have to be textures. You can't, the sprites are textures. You have to generalize it into 3D. It's not going to generalize into 2D.
Okay.
2D is a subset of 3D. It's not the other way around. So there was a bit of to and fro about that, and we kept Direct Draw alive for a little while, but then they realized it was going to get sucked into the 3D. And it was me and Steve Lacey worked very hard for a week. There was some Microsoft show coming out, and we basically updated the RenderMorphics driver model. We worked out a new way to cut through the Windows. There was this thing, I'm trying to remember what it's called in Windows, which separates the applications from the hardware. They called it thunking or something. And there's this hardware call where you punch through into the 32-bit layer. We worked out a method of making a 32-bit driver. And so we updated the RenderMorphics driver model to be a 32-bit driver inside Windows 95. So we could call into the hardware and write a 3D driver in 32-bit code. Working with the Direct Draw guys, we worked this all out, and we updated the RenderMorphics driver, and that's basically when Direct3D was born. Basically, the hard work was getting a way within Windows 32-bit code to cut through into the hardware world with 32-bit code as well, and just take the hit once, doing this thunk, which cuts through all the insulation between the two layers, and get down to the hardware. So then we could design the hardware interface. And I think it was running, there was two cards we had it running on. We had it running on the 3D Blaster and the Renditions card, which was, I'm trying to remember what it was called, Rendition. There was another hardware company that disappeared, but we were running on those two. and we had APIs working in Windows using Direct3D for filling in the textures and doing 3D meshes that were being transformed on the hardware side and rendered on the hardware side. Though the transformation was still being done in software, we could support it in hardware if the hardware did it.
Interesting. Now, so this melding of your existing tech, the rewriting of a direct draw for the 2D elements. Now, how much compatibility was still left with your old API at that point?
Well, it kept breaking things. We were working very hard to keep the old apps going, but one of the jumps, the main break happened was like that point when I said we'd released a version of Reality Lab that kept our old apps going. You could even run, we were working at Microsoft and we could even still support some PlayStation people because we wanted to keep these developers going. We were committed to our developers. I mean, we developed relationships with these guys. We loved these guys. We loved what they were building and we really cared about it. But here's Microsoft, we're merging with Direct3D. We had to come up with a new version of the interface that worked with COM, which was the Microsoft component object model. And we came up with a version of the interface that did that, but it was done with a wrapper so we could do it fast. So it actually slowed things down. So this is where people who began using the new version of the high-level interface started getting some performance penalties, whereas the old guys that were making the more hardcore games running on the old system working with us, they could still run fast.
Gotcha.
And that's when really there was a split within Direct3D. There was a high-level version of the interface and a low-level version of the interface. And because the high-level version had switched to Microsoft COM and we'd done that fast, it lost a lot of the performance wins. And that's when people started gravitating towards the low-level version of Direct3D, which at that time was a very hard-to-use interface right on top of the driver. It was bare bones down to the metal. So it was hard to use, but it could go really fast. It was the fastest way of accessing the hardware at the time.
Gotcha. Now, from the internal politics side of it, obviously Windows 95 is coming out at a time when PlayStation's already out in Japan. The US launch is coming out the same year. There's this pressure for Windows PCs for IBM compatibles not to fall by the wayside. How big did you feel was the role of games in Microsoft's overall plan for the operating system?
It was a critical decision of why they bought the company. They wanted the credibility. That's why I said that's one of the reasons they were buying Rendermorphics, was we had great credibility with game studios. Microsoft didn't have credibility.
Okay.
They were just laughed at in those days because you made games on DOS, but you didn't make games on Windows because Windows Media was really broken.
Gotcha.
So that's what we were fixing. But as we came into Microsoft, we came into this thing where there was lots of different teams proposing different fixes. Direct3D was only one of them. There were people fixing Windows Media. There was the video guys working within Windows Media. There was a different team that they were doing an accelerated video stuff. There was the OpenGL team within Windows NT, which was separate from Windows 3.1 team at that time.
Oh, wow.
So there was all sorts of crazy stuff, and I just was dropped in the middle of all of this, and I thought, hey, I thought you guys were one company, and it's like, yes, but this is a big company, and there's lots of different teams all competing. I had never worked in a big car. I was a kid that made 3D code.
Yeah. Wow. So Direct3D finally does launch, and it does start to gain steam. It becomes the de facto now. How did you perceive that adoption? What was your relationship with developers like once you were inside of Microsoft?
it starts getting very chaotic because everyone wants to access you, and this is something, when you've just developed a fresh API, there's not much documentation. My time is whether I spend time with the documentation guy who doesn't understand that much about 3D code, or do I spend that time with a studio that's actually going to make a game? So our time's really precious, and I've got a load of bugs that I know I need to fix, and I know I've got to get a new version out that really fixes things properly, because the last version was a bit of a hack and we just rushed it out. And you can just get things done, but the next version is going to get things done better, and we need to get that out in a few months. So, time is very precious, and there's only like 3 or 4 of us developers that really understand how any of this works.
That was going to be my next question. I mean, how big is the team at this point, and how many people actually understand what's going on? So
there's about 3 or 4 of us that actually understand. We've got about 3 or 4 other developers that support us that understand it less well.
Oh man.
And it's a new company that we're in, and we don't really know how to work with anyone, and we're just learning about all of this stuff. And
oh, that's great.
It was really crazy. It was really crazy. And so everybody else also wants to take over the Direct3D project. That's the other thing.
Really?
Yeah, there's lots of teams because they understand how exciting it is. There's all this politics within Microsoft, and I suddenly realized, hey, all these guys don't know anything about 3D, but they want to do the 3D project. They don't even know about the 3D hardware and all this experience we'd had. So it was really, it was a bit crazy.
Was there any pressure to work with certain developers over other ones? Was there anybody, like, if id Software called, you had to take that call, but you could put somebody else on the back burner or something like that?
Well, the developer relations within Microsoft was very powerful, and they're smart and they know what that's an important thing. So developer relations would actually steer us and say, these are the guys you got to work with now, or these guys, and I'd work with them. So I was getting pulled between key studios I needed to work with to help them actually get to work. And still at that time, the hardware wasn't that good. And you had to really skew your game for which hardware you were associating with, whether it was going to be 3DFX or 3D Labs was around, or the creative 3D Blast. You had to really pick it. And so those hardware guys were paying studios to make games for them. It wasn't truly general. And at the same time, I was trying to help some people make the truly general games for the hardware that wasn't there yet, but I knew was coming. And it's a difficult time, this major transition. We were also working a lot with Intel that want us to do crazy things to get software rendering to work fast. And they were doing stuff like they were doing new bus models. They wanted us to render with the CPU across the bus.
Okay. So they were actually pushing to essentially counter program against the 3D accelerators by saying, hey, software can do it just fine, upgrade your CPU.
They were doing software rendering, but to render to the frame buffer on the hardware. So they'd done, I'm trying to remember what it was called, but they'd done a new bus model where they were saying you could render with the CPU across into the GPU memory. And I came out, I made a big mistake. I came out and said, this is impossible because the memory bandwidth of that is slower than the memory that we can render in software to the frame buffer on the CPU memory and just copy it across. It would go slower. And I announced that at a hardware vendor talk I was doing. And then I realized I wasn't supposed to do this, but I was saying, well, anyone can work it out if you just work the numbers out. But I was supposed to go through like political channels within Microsoft because Microsoft and Intel were very close at that time. And they had a sort of secret partnership where Microsoft would do things for Intel, Intel would do things for Microsoft, and I was unaware of all of that.
Oh, that must have been a nasty little bit of fallout.
Yeah. But yeah, they were trying to do that. So I was trying to accommodate, there was all these forces, but very few of them were actually forces that were about making good games right for what's coming down the line. So I was a purist. I wanted to make good games, get the most out of the hardware, and educate people to do that. And I was just chucked into this maelstrom of opposing forces where really to keep my position, I had to make alliances with the ones that could best politically protect our team. And I wasn't doing that. I was making technical decisions off what was best for games and what was best for the technology and what was best for developers. And I realized after a period of time that wasn't going to preserve my team within Microsoft. That's not the way to operate.
Oh, okay. So this sounds like this is the beginning of the end of your tenure then at Microsoft.
Well, I was on a 2-year contract anyway. And
Okay.
Basically, I made the decision then that, I don't like working in that scenario. I want to do the right thing rather than what's going to keep my team going. So I made the decision for the team because the rest of my guys actually a lot of them wanted to stay at Microsoft. So I cared for them. And so I made the decision. There was after Windows 98, there was this merge with the Windows NT team. So there was a bunch of political things always rolling. This is constantly going within a big company. So there's Windows 98. There was a version. So we did DirectX 2 that had a sort of bolt-on of Direct3D. Then DirectX 3 had much better 3D. And then we were halfway through a much better version of Direct3D, but we merged with the NT team, with the Windows NT team. So the OpenGL guys got involved we were merging, and that made sense to me, technically, merge OpenGL and Direct3D. But that's when my contract expired and I could technically leave. And I decided I'm out of here. I don't want to stay in this type of environment. It's exciting and I've learned a lot, but I don't like company politics where you've got to make decisions like that. And that's when the NT guys took the code base that we developed, but they rolled it back to DirectX 3 and they lost a ton of good stuff that we'd done. And then they restarted the work and they threw out a bunch of stuff because the mind share was in our heads. And, with code, it's very hard to go mid-project. So they took a step back and then they made a simpler interface to Direct3D that wouldn't go as fast, but was easier to use. So they addressed some of the concerns because the Direct3D interface at that time with execute buffers was fast, but very hard to use.
Okay. And so once you're out of Microsoft, did you have a plan of what you wanted to do? Was there a post Microsoft bucket list, so to speak?
I wanted to have a rest because I'd worked really hard. I'd done 2 years and a few months of really hard graft getting these versions of Direct3D done. I felt I'd made the achievement of getting 3D into Windows and making that driver model actually work. So that was for me what I wanted to achieve. I just wanted to do the right thing technically, getting it done. And the main achievement for me that I was excited by was when NVIDIA actually implemented our driver model more directly. So we had this driver model, but no hardware was using it well, and NVIDIA came along and finally actually implemented the TL vertex, which was a type of vertex that I defined inside the header file of Direct3D. And they implemented that in hardware, and they could consume the vertices without needing to change the formats or anything. And at that point, I knew that the road was clear for 3D hardware to really happen, because that was really our goal with Direct3D. As purists, we wanted to enable 3D hardware to happen. The time I talked to you about when we were designing the 3D hardware model for Direct3D, where Direct3D didn't exist, that 1 week when me and Steve Lacey coded for a week with hardly any sleep, we were visioning 10 years down the line when 3D hardware would exist. There wasn't, it was still nascent. And we downloaded that hardware driver. We knew it was going to be for the whole industry, and Microsoft was just the vehicle for making it happen. And that's what we cared about. So I was happy I'd done that part. And then when NVIDIA started doing what they were doing, they saw the architecture that we put in place, and they saw how it could be implemented. And from that point, it was just about iterating and cleaning up.
Gotcha.
So that's why I knew I could leave, and my work had been done.
The baby was going to be okay.
Yeah, exactly. Because I knew 3D hardware was important for me and for everyone else. It wasn't really Microsoft.
Now, and two things come out of this for me. First, are you still gaming at all at this point?
I'm not so much playing games, but I'm still fascinated by games. I don't have so much time to play, but I'm very involved in looking at games, and
Okay.
I still play. I still play plenty of games.
And my other one was, so while you are building Direct3D at Microsoft, one of the industry standards is 3D effects with their glide on the system. So what was your view at that time of these hardware specific systems that had cropped up from time to time, or had success in the market? Was it seen as a step back for you personally? Did you see it as a step back not having a universal system, or did you think that that was maybe the better way to go?
I did believe the better way to go in the end was unifying, because I knew there'd be more innovation if everyone's competing down a more standardized platform. And my job was to bring a standardized API together so that we could make the games. Now, Glide was great. The problem we had with Direct3D was the driver they did with Direct3D was not as good. It was not as fast as using Glide Direct. So again, I was always having to choose my resources. If I went in there with some of my hand coding guys, we could have made the Direct3D driver much faster. We would pick certain cards to start really improving the drivers for. And Microsoft went on and did that after I left for a long time, as we were unifying. So when hardware was really hard to make in those days, it would have been better to have lots of different pieces of hardware. But each year the innovations were moving so fast that suddenly everyone could do all the features that we needed to make a unified API. And at that point, it makes much more sense for the industry to standardize.
Gotcha. Okay, now post Microsoft, you're getting some rest. Where do you go from there?
I quite rapidly, I rested for a few months, but then I started coding on a new engine. I wanted to just see what was possible in 3D again. And a year later, I started another company called Cube Software. And we started making a game, we started making an engine. We made quite a lot of technology for companies. We did quite a lot of game engine technology we were supplying at Cube. We worked for some hardware companies. We did some demo work. I mean, the bigger things I did that were more well known at Cube was I did work for Lego. There was a product called Lego Digital Designer.
Yeah, and I was going to ask about that. I mean, the challenge, obviously, of that many little blocks being able to interact with one another or building something. How did you approach that?
We spent a while designing a physics engine. It was one of the things I wanted to get into as an engine group. So our engine team started designing a physics engine specifically for Lego so they could do simulations. So again, our thing was building SDK. So we built a Lego SDK after we'd done rendermorphics, and it was managing all the simulation. Though the Lego company had a high-tech team in-house and they had quite a good model that we could work from for how they were gridding and standardizing all the Lego bricks. So we took that and designed a high-performance library for it.
Okay, and so your focus at Cube, though, was trying to create engines as opposed to actual finished game product, right?
It was both, because I knew when you build an engine, you need a demo, and the demo costs most of the game. Building the demo is very expensive, so I thought let's try and build a game too. But what we were looking to do is try and figure out what a new type of engine would be, because with 3D hardware, we knew it's not about the rasterization. And over a lot of iteration, we realized it was about a nice clean framework. So we were developing what we called the Q engine, which was a very clean, very easy to use framework that could tie together lots of different modules. So you could change any module within it and always bring in someone else's physics engine, somebody else's rasterizer. You could bring any piece together. So it was more like where web frameworks are going these days.
Okay. And that I'm guessing that you needed some kind of standardized model for importing those. Were you working with other studios that were making things like physics engines and so forth to try to create a standard, or were you trying to adapt the outside engines inside of the
We were pulling in other people's engines wherever needed. So we did versions with plugins with the physics engines, plugins with various tools. But that's when I realized we weren't really a big enough company. We were like 40 people, and the engine team was only 10 people, and it was becoming much more industrial scale. And things were just changing. I needed to be a much bigger company. I needed to be not a 40, 50-man studio. And I was split, the company was split. We had a 10-man technology team doing the engine, and then a lot of the other people were making the game side of stuff. So we were doing games and demos and this work for Lego. We did a Lego Harry Potter game. We were doing a game for Virgin Interactive at the time. We just weren't big enough, so I started needing to look at venture capital and scaling up the company, and I just started feeling, hold on, this is not really the way I like to be a small studio. I like to be innovating, and I didn't want to be growing. And it was really I put all my eggs in one basket instead to get behind a project called Earthsim, which was doing a version of, it was something like Google Earth, but more of an interactive gamified version where you could travel around the solar system. It was an early version of the Universe Sandbox.
Okay.
Type thing.
Interesting.
And so I put all of our dev effort into that because I wanted to create an engine demo with it. So it was doing both. It was spend on the demo but make a product, but also build an engine. And at the same time, I was looking to raise venture capital, but we hit the 2008 financial crisis, and that's really what ended the company.
Oh, too bad.
Yeah.
So did the assets from that game get picked up by anybody, or?
I managed to restart it on a much smaller scale.
Okay.
And I kept things going for a while, and but then I stopped because I needed to revision things, and I'd worked very hard with Cube, and I'd done a lot of stuff. Again, I took on too much personally. I think I was driving too many projects myself, and we had a few other good people, but it was just too challenging to really pull off the scaling up that we would have needed. We'd have needed to go from a 50-man studio to like a 200, 300-man studio. And we didn't have the financial skills within the company. And I was too involved also in the technology. If I kept coming away from the technology and just taking the CEO role, other things would start suffering.
Gotcha. And
so it was a typical scale-up problem, and I couldn't make the jump in 2008. If 2008 hadn't have happened, I think I probably would have made it. But in a way, I'm happier I didn't, because I made some really good transitions in my life to keep things on a more sustainable level now.
I was going to ask whether or not at any of those points, any of the big publishers or so forth had approached you to acquire the studio, especially since you had done a Harry Potter game.
We had a number of acquisition opportunities. Again, people wanted the team, they wanted me to be brought in, but the problem I had was I left Microsoft already. You know, I'd been acquired and I didn't like working in a big company. So money, because when I left Microsoft, I walked away from some pretty big golden handcuffs. So money didn't motivate me. You know, it was more about doing technology right. And I'd made that decision in my life. So it was no longer about money. It was always about doing what's best for the technology and best for the industry. So acquisitions didn't excite me.
Gotcha. That
And, yeah,
that's pretty noble right there.
I don't know if it's noble. It was less fun for me to be stuck in a big corporation dealing with politics.
I hear you. I hear you. So after Cube, you tried doing it like you said, Earthsim Limited.
Yeah,
That was founded to continue that project, correct?
that was founded to continue the project. We had quite a large number of users, and had I scaled down the project fast enough, could have supported it financially for it to have taken off. But I didn't scale it down fast enough, and I was still attached to some of the good coders we had, and I didn't want to lose them. And I couldn't break even. So yeah. But I've restarted that project, and I'm looking for ways to actually pick it up again. So, but I'm going on a very small burn right now.
Now, are you restarting it with the old code base and old assets? Or are you trying to, as a retro thing, or are you trying to restart the concept with a whole new program?
I have access to all the old assets, and some of them are still pretty good. But I'm building a new engine first, and I want to build a new simulation engine that works on a much smaller tile of landscape, because we've got some incredible power in PCs now. Like, it's just amazing what you can do on the CPU and the GPU. So
Yeah.
I'm excited to build a new simulation engine, and I'm looking to build a team to do that, to really maximize and find a sweet spot in simulations where we can have a very dynamic simulation game.
Interesting. And I've got to ask, with your experience having built engines before, big and small, what do you think, or what lessons that you've learned from working at big companies and small are you trying to apply to this new development?
It's the main core skill that I would say I've got is understanding how to make things go really fast on a chip. How, like, some of the stuff we did in the Direct3D rasterizers is still, I don't think, have been beaten today in rasterizing tech. You know,
Okay.
Just how you really work with the cache, how you work with the instruction latencies to really optimize stuff. It's all about memory, how you manage your memory, how you work with all the levels of the hierarchy of the cache. So picking the algorithms, picking the memory usage to really hit those sweet spots that, you know, once you hit those sweet spots, you can do some magic on the inside.
Gotcha. Interesting. Now, I always ask this, did I miss anything? Was there any major topic I should have asked about?
I think we covered a lot. Broad
Yeah,
brush
we
strokes.
did.
It feels like we covered a lot.
Okay. Then the last question that I always ask all of my interview subjects, looking back at your career, what would you say was one industry trend that got really big that you did not see coming, that caught you by surprise? And what was one trend that you thought was going to take off that ended up sputtering out and doing nothing?
The ones that didn't do nothing is difficult because I've always been fairly good with my predictions. Like, I picked 3D and I picked the internet. Those were things I thought were going to do well. I'm not sure the ones that didn't do nothing. That's a really hard question because, you know, we quickly vector off something that is not going anywhere. No, I actually can't answer that.
Okay.
I'd need to think hard about that. I probably have the answer, but you need to have given me that question ahead of time to think about, because
Yeah, but see, then I wouldn't have this amazing response, which is so fun.
yeah, okay. Yeah, I can't. I mean, that's a hard question. I'm
Yeah.
sure I'm sure I had a few, but like I said, I'm very much about crystal ball gazing in the future. I'm very much about knowing where the hardware's going, where the technology's going. And one of my problems has been I often see too far ahead. So I make things that can't be funded yet, but and I run out of funding before when people start funding them.
Mm.
So one of the mistakes I make is I go too soon because I see something too far down the line. But yeah, I'll think about that.
Okay. And the first part, something that you didn't see coming that caught you by surprise?
Um, Again, I can't answer it.
Okay.
I
Perfectly legit.
The only thing that caught me by surprise was more how the financial system shifted, more the cycles of finance in running a business. But in technology, I've normally been able to predict things very well. It's just whether I can keep up with the changes and can address them financially. So often the predictions are right. It's then tracking the financials to support the predictions. That's where the mistakes get made.
I'll believe it. I'll believe it. Okay. Servan, thank you so very much for your time. This has really been a fascinating insight into the basic architecture of computer gaming as we have it today. And thank you for your work. And oh, wait, we didn't even talk about. So anybody who's watching this, you are not in what we would call a traditional building right now. So where are you, and what are you doing there?
I'm in a yurt in Portugal, because the other project I'm looking at is the other technology that excited me is how can we live off grid?
Okay.
So that goes all the way to even the community of how we build, where the houses go, what size houses, how we build the houses. So I've been exploring all types of solar infrastructure, ground heating, thermal mass of houses, what types of houses. I've been doing a ton of stuff with all various building technologies. So that's the other branch I'm exploring.
And I do have to ask, because it sounds very much like you're employing a lot of your old physics education there, trying to
Yeah,
figure out all of that. Now, the complexity of trying to solve this problem, living off grid, uh, what aspect of, if you will, the gamification of it, the social aspects of it, have you tried looking into those as well, or are you sticking purely to the structural?
totally. I'm looking at the social aspects, but like solving any problem, the way I solve a problem is first I have to understand what the problem is. I have to understand the questions. So the only way I can ever do that is throw myself into it myself and experience it. I have to viscerally absorb the questions so I can ask them correctly.
Mhm.
So I have to go and live off grid. I have to find out what sucks, what really doesn't work. Look at what everybody else is trying to do. Look at the smart people of how they're trying to do it, and then start applying my experience. And that's also where the Earthsim technology that I'm developing now applies, because I'm looking to build a simulator and gamify it to teach some of these skills. So I actually want to make a game around surviving in small areas of landscape to actually simulate the local environmental conditions all the way down to the soil models and the water and the evaporation, so people can play. Because the skill I think we've lost that's vital as a society is what I'm calling multi-generational land management. It's a skill that's really is totally lost, and it's an art. It's an art form, and it's held within indigenous cultures. It's precious thing. Some indigenous cultures talk about 7 generations. When you make a decision on land, or when you make a decision, you've got to think 7 generations down the line. Well, I want to make games that actually can you create land that survives 1,000 years. So I want to accelerate time and make games like that. So that's what I'm looking to do in Earthsim. But at the same time, I'm requirements gathering by doing it for real. So
That's that is both inspiring, and I'm already imagining a million players standing in front of desolate wastelands on their monitors as they basically try to act out like we are actually acting out in the real world.
It's incredibly fulfilling to be able to look at a desert and know you can turn it around into something that can become incredibly valuable or somewhere amazing to live.
Yes, and I hope that it has the educational, it meets the educational goals that you're setting for.
It has to be fun first. If it can be fun, it will educate. My belief in games is that if you're having fun, you're being educated. It may be motor neuron skills that you're educating, but you're being educated. So if you put in a little bit of learning about something, that if it's applying some real world dynamics, you're going to learn about stuff.
That is very true. Very, very
fun is education to me. It's the way nature learns. It's the way all animals. Fun means you're learning at maximum bandwidth.
Fun means you're learning at max. Okay, I'm going to have to crib that one. That's actually really good. Okay.
The more fun you're having, the more you are fresh, the more you're dropping and you're going into neuroplasticity, you're beginning to absorb at full bandwidth.
Interesting.
That's when you're evolving, that's when you're going, that's when you're developing. That's what you want in a game. That's why I love games. It's just we've yet to use that medium to its full extent.
Very true. I teach at a university, and I was due to budget cuts, I have to postpone it now. But I was about to launch a high-level English as a foreign language course here in Germany, where the entire course was going to be built around playing Dungeons and Dragons.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's cool.
Well, it was C2 level, you know, it's constantly shifting back and forth between voices and tenses, technical rule lawyering plus character rolling. And really that was going to be the impetus of the course. Had to cut it back until next year because of budget cuts. But you're right. Education, fun, it means you're learning at maximum bandwidth. Sorry, it's a great line. So thank you. Servan, thank you very much for your time. Keep up the good work, and I will be watching out for when we get the next version of Earthsim.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. It was a lot of fun.
Okay.